aspect to observational studies, and if we had more people that were contributing to society with meta-analysis and using useful information rather than useless information, we would have similar stories to this Robert Semmelweis story. And Professor Tim Noakes eloquently presented this in a beautiful XY axis. He showed that for a period of 10 to 20 years, there was an increase in the mortality of these hospitals where at the same time male doctors were treating, they were conducting post-mortems, and they were also delivering newborns in the same wing or the same hospital. And it was Semmelweis who said that there's something that cannot be seen with the naked eye. We have a situation where there's an epidemic and a cause for the increase in mortality, because the issue that he was noting was that not just hundreds but thousands of childbirths, as well as the mothers giving birth, there was a no point of return. We had a population problem that could have led to even more of a setback in modern advancement at this point in time, because this was after the Black Plague in terms of history. But Robert Semmelweis was instrumental in showing that there's something that is not being seen with the naked eye, and if there was some form of an intervention with these male doctors that were either delivering children at this maternity ward, and they had methodology of chlorine washings, then we were going to observe what the cause and effect would be between the mortality rates of young women and their infants, as well as the intervention to a control, and what was the subsequent mortality rates over a 20-40 year period. And this was conducted between 1840s and 1860s. And it was very clear with the research. Thousands of lives were noted, and the mortality rate decreased significantly. It's that small p less than 0.05 in statistical significance. I remember seeing this graph, and I think Professor Tim Noakes, he enjoyed the enthusiasm, that because I sat very close, because I felt the first lecture or the first series of lectures, he was going to give all the good stuff, and you're going to need your class of 2000 to pay attention and to be more hooked earlier than later. And if that was the case, then I feel the series, because we went through exercise science, sports medicine, and the earlier that he would have your attention, I believe that he was just going to build momentum in that learning curve, which meant that your critical thinking and also your paradigm shift would not be biased. It would be very neutral. And I reiterate that fact that it was a destination. So the destination was to be in this class, to have that type of person surround me with that type of influence. But once again, I wish I could see it as a journey and how I would use it as a cross-reference, because that Robert Semmelweis study, the chlorine washings was the intervention, and that actually reduced the mortality rate by 1,000 deaths. So it was by 1860 that it became standard practice that there would be chlorine washings, and this was still not separating post-mortem ward to the maternity ward. Also, we were in a position where the chlorine washings were actually taken from Europe and issued to North America as general practice. So you see the data, and I mean, you would trust a meta-analysis, and you would trust the actual graphs as being published in an international journal, edited, and at the end of the day, there probably wasn't as many bodies or areas of expertise that could, write off or would agree on a certain paradigm. So I was very much trusting that information, and that could have been maybe a weakness from my side. But just looking at the conviction of Professor Noakes, because he's now presenting in 2004, and we're talking about someone who's had a career not in sports sciences, but the applied sciences since the 60s. So if someone, you can tell, there's the bullshit factor. When someone is questioning something that is quality driven, and they've gone through all the null hypothesis to realize they can't disprove something like this, and he has put it on top of the list to make an example of how you would have been crucified and extricated back in those days for trying to change the science and trying to go against religion. But Robert Semmelweis, he was ridiculed for 15, 20 years, and he still stuck by his underlying statement that he believed that there was something that was more to the naked eye, and we as a society could benefit from the hardcore sciences that he managed to present. And we are thankful to him from a Western medicine perspective, because chlorine washings then became the study not of epidemiology, but it also led to microbiology being a massive field of study. We now have understood virology, immunology, and we've gone to the power of 10 to the minus 6 when you consider the size of these cause and effect models. You would have understood maybe microbiology in the penicillin stage, the 1910s and the 1920s. But if we look at where we are now, we are dealing with nanotechnology. Very scary for some people, because we are going to be moving towards automation, biotechnology, which means that the biological function has reached a saturation curve, and what happens now from an automation or from a machine learning perspective, it is truly unfathomable what can be achieved. And this is all from Robert Semmelweis pointing out that these male doctors, they can't be dealing with a post-mortem with their hands and then having to physically handle or physically perform a different function without there being an intervention of some sort to sterilize where his hands have been. And even though the naked eye feels that there's nothing on the hands, the microbiology as to how these microbodies can transport through our conditions of a human has an optimum pH, an optimum temperature, an optimum environment in which to thrive. And I mean, there's a whole Darwinian route we can go with that. But I keep thinking about that lecture in 2004, because Mind Drives Performance will, in some ways, support the Noakes theory that the central governor for fatigue and the central governor for pacing strategies and performance are all highly correlated. And I can't really go into the physiological and the performance basis for why certain physiology traits benefit certain genetic predisposition. But at the end of the day, it helps us understand that the human mind is very much wired for adaptability and evolving rather than consistency and keeping the same as the times that we were in. The exponential change is happening around us in all aspects, not just biology, but also with the advancements in technology. And also people that travel now have opened up that epidemiological question. Because as I said to you, in 1840, what was the mode of transport at that time? We had ships that were very unsuccessful in some of their trade routes. The actual cost of the human life was very differently valued than I think what we would consider on comparative terms or equivalent terms. I think it's very sad, but in those days, don't really have some exact numbers for you. And how would you go about being more accurate with census where it just takes such a long time for point A to get to point B in the 1840s? There was no air travel. There was no commercial viability. You would have to almost for travel and for military was sometimes mixed in with commercial and industrial, which is ridiculous. But I'm not going to head into that too much. 1840s, from a mode of transport question, there was no air travel. From Europe to North America, it was only sea options. Of course, in 1840, it was very popular to have trains, and the railway system was in effect. The Americans were building from east to west, and you would imagine that all those arteries of railways were just a blueprint for the car that would be developed in another 80 years' time to use that artery for self-travel. Once again, personal and individual needs would be met over a span of 100 years, from the communal and almost a mining town type of locus of areas. So we sit with this right now today because a lot of the diversity and the epigenome, which is a very integrative approach to understanding modern times, is we would be very ignorant to look at the gene code of someone today and say, well, it takes about 1,000 years to have a mutation or a variance, and we've got a situation where 200 years ago there was slavery from West Africa to get to North America. The Chinese were heavily being shipped in some sort of a slave trade to get the railway system done in North America. That code is in us. The ancestral code is in us, and we still don't feel like the brain is well understood, because at the end of the day, going back to Dr. Robert Semmelweis, he showed that we can start looking at microbiology and understanding our physiology a bit better. But we've come so far to get to 1953, where DNA was discovered by Watson and Crick, and obviously well, not obviously, but in 50 years from now,